Thank you, Mary Claire. Appreciate it, as always. Like she said, I think it's my third or fourth time to speak at the library. And we actually did a book launch on Wicked Columbus, Indiana, 2016. That's when it came out, June of 2016. And the book is basically, it's available in hardcover, paperback, ebook, just about everywhere. I always tell people, go to your local bookstore and get it, unless you want to get it from the table back there when we're done. We love to keep our local bookstores in business, and they have them at Viewpoint here in town, and they are autographed. So, let's move on. We'd like to welcome everybody in person, full house in person. I'd like to welcome people on Facebook through the library's account and YouTube. Just quick show of hands, where did you guys find out about this? Did you find out about it through the library?
Facebook.
Yeah. Facebook?
Newspaper.
Newspaper, okay. So some people saw this in the newspaper, but we were the number 2. This event is number 2, according to Brian Blair of the Republic, as far as things to do in upcoming weeks as of July 8th, 2021. That's when this got the paper. And what you probably noticed when you looked at this and drew your attention was that Paul Hoffman is a solid researcher and writer. I'm sure that was it. If it wasn't that, then it was this. Whether you're reading the book or catching Hoffman's off-the-cuff wicked wit and storytelling, there's no room for boredom. So just off-the-cuff wicked wit, which is a lot to live up to. And I did wear a shirt with cuffs, so I think we're gonna be good. If you get bored, blame Brian Blair, because he wrote this. So, oh, I did a transition. I didn't even know I did a transition like that. I noticed how it went like that. That was kind of cool. Okay, that's me. I think that's me like 2 pairs of glasses ago. A 10-year-old headshot. I don't have that much more, well, maybe a little bit more gray. I had cataract surgery in May and haven't gotten new pictures taken yet. So I'm not wearing glasses except for, I've got some tears just in case I have small type that I need to read. But so that's an old picture, but hopefully you recognize some sort of similarity here. A little bit about me. I've been a Columbus resident since 2009. That's when I married my wife, and I moved here from Shelbyville. Been an Indiana resident since 1994. I was born and raised in Wisconsin. Spent 34 years in journalism, working in different papers in Wisconsin, Illinois, and Indiana. Started out as a sports writer, so I did that for a while. I was a sports editor. The last, I think it ended up being like about 19 years and 10 months or something of my career was a special publications editor for HNE and In Media, which is the umbrella company for the Republic here in Columbus, and Franklin's, about 5 or 6 other papers. I'm the author of 2 nonfiction / history true crime books, one of which is Wicked Columbus, Indiana. I'm the owner of Pathfinder Publishing, which I just bought last May. We're a hybrid publishing company. We publish all sorts of different genres. I've got some books from that publishing company on the back table if you're curious to find out a little bit more about that. And I'm a husband. My wife, Kimberly, is in the back. She's going to help me a little bit here today. Few readings from a couple of example chapters from the book. Father of 6, I think. I don't know. I lost count after 5. But 4 of them are mine, 2 of them are hers. Between the 2 of us, we've got 6, and that's enough. No more. I need to tell you just a little briefly about my first book, because it's the reason that Wicked Columbus, Indiana actually exists. This is Murder in Wauwatosa, the mysterious death of Buddy Schumacher. It's a story that I found out about originally when I was a little kid living in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, just outside of Milwaukee. The neighbor lady next door, wonderful lady, 95% of the time. One of the 5% of the time, she'd come out and say, the police know who killed the Schumacher boy. She would say this to me, I'm like 8 years old. I don't want to hear anything more about it. And I walk away. Why, a couple of weeks later, he was killed by the river, by the railroad tracks. Okay, that's enough. It never came up again, except it was in the back of my head for 30, 5 years or whatever it was. I finally looked into it, got on the internet, found people carrying the casket out of a house, and the line said, "Murdered boy Arthur Buddy Schumacher." Okay, well, my dad had bought a house from a Mr. Schumacher, and I'm like, "Dad, do you know anything about a murdered brother, son, whatever?" "No, don't know anything." Come to find out, I was starting to do research for this book. 8-year-old boy went missing in 1925. 2 years after he died, his parents moved into a new house, which the dad lived in until 1969 when my dad bought the house from him. So I lived in, the house that his father owned. It was really strange, and the things that I found out about this were just so interesting. Anyway, the publisher was the History Press out of South Carolina. A couple years after this was published, they said, "Hey, you did a really good job on that book. Translation, we sold books. So, do you want to write something about where you live now?" I said, "I don't know that I have an entire, like one story that could fill an entire book like I did, with this one." And I said, "I work for the local newspaper, and if you give me a year, by that time, all of the newspapers that have been produced here since 1872 will be online, will be searchable, and I will have a free account because I work for the company." They said, "Okay." So that's how Wicked Columbus, Indiana came about. And that's the real reason we're here. To talk about things like prostitution and fisticuffs, villainy, prohibition. That didn't work out. That's supposed to be up there. We're gonna have to redo this. Poisoning, general all-around nastiness from a really long time ago, okay? None of this stuff has happened, well, I don't know if none of this stuff has happened, but I didn't write about anything like this that happened after 1977. So I'll talk to just a little bit about doing a little bit of research to try to find the stories in this book. Columbus, the streets were not named the same thing. The numbered streets, they did not have numbered streets in 1879. So if I'm looking up information on things that happened back then, and they tell me where something happened, and they tell me it was on Mulberry Street, I'm like, there is no Mulberry Street here. What are you talking about? I had to go back to old maps and things like that to find out. Pretty sure Mulberry Street's First Street now. But all the numbered streets had different names. So that was one of the tricks in trying to find out where some of the things happened in Wicked Columbus, Indiana. Another resource was William Marsh wrote a book called I Discovered Columbus. William Marsh, this book came out in the early 1900s, and William Marsh lived here and talked about things that he had remembered from the late 1800s into the early 1900s. A lot of things that ended up being inspiration for stories to look into to decide whether I wanted to put them in the book. The thing with William Marsh was he was going from memory, and he did not exactly have everything totally straight in his book, which is why when I talk about doing research for nonfiction and things like that, I always tell people you gotta find information, you gotta make sure it's right, corroborate information. William Marsh had all sorts of awesome things in his book. I couldn't pinpoint everything that I wanted to write about in his book somewhere else. So there were a couple of stories that he had that it's like, I think I'll leave that one alone. Spent a lot of time on the second floor of the Bartholomew County Historical Society. They have a really great little library up there with all sorts of stuff. There are historians from way back who hand wrote a bunch of notes. There are pictures of all sorts of different things, schools, things that don't exist anymore, events and things like that. It took a long, long time to sift through everything I needed to sift through to decide if it was something that would fit in one of the stories I was doing. But Dairy Queen's right across the street, so that worked out pretty well. Again, the Republic Archives, they were online by the time I started researching this book. So I did a lot of research online. Being that I had a free account, that worked out really well. I had an account for Ancestry.com and a couple other different things. Go through the library, has all sorts of different things to look at. If you go through the library, you have the library card and you get online at the library, you don't even have to come here to the Indiana room and look up things in microfilm. You can look up census reports and all sorts of other things, find out all sorts of different things. And now, we're going to start with a few readings from a few chapters. I believe that the first one is going to be read by my beautiful, wonderful wife, Kimberly Hoffman, who also is an author. She writes children's books, and some of hers are here in the library. But I will let her read about the other side of the tracks, which is some of the basically slum areas of Columbus over the years.
As with most cities, Columbus has had its share of downtrodden neighborhoods over the years. For most of its history, the areas that housed the poorest residents and were plagued by higher crime rates than other parts of the cities were situated along the west and south sides of Columbus. Smoky Row, Jug Row, Happy Hollow, and Death Valley all pretty much fell into this pattern, with substandard housing, rat infestations, flooding, and higher crime rates being among the most common problems. Here's an excerpt from the chapter that discusses these areas. Another area that was literally on the other side of the tracks was a pox on Columbus for the first half of the 20th century. Death Valley was sandwiched between the White River and the Pennsylvania Railroad tracks at the west end of 4th and 5th Streets. It was plagued by rats, disease, substandard housing, and flooding. The poorest of the poor lived here from the depths of the Great Depression until the early 1960s. Even poor people in Columbus's other blighted neighborhoods felt sorry for the people who lived in Death Valley. A reporter and photographer from the Evening Republican went into the neighborhood in May of 1957 to document living conditions because, the story said, most residents of Columbus had never set foot on the other side of the tracks. Speaking about one family of 4, the reporter said, "I saw a lean-to type of dwelling built with old boards and packing cases right on the river's edge. High waters during flood stage along the river had left its traces of mud and silt over the entire structure. The doorway was open without a screen, even though the mosquitoes were swarming in droves." A mother wrote of her trip to Death Valley when delivering food to the needy during the holidays in 1957, and the letter was published in the Evening Republican, no doubt pulling at the heartstrings of many local residents. The woman and a fireman assigned to help her deliver the baskets arrived at a Death Valley home that sported boarded-up windows, a broken door, and wood floors. They had to place the food on the floor since there were no cabinets. The woman said that one little boy, when he saw the food, asked, "Is there any meat?" She assured him there was, which prompted one of the biggest smiles the woman had ever seen. When they left the house in the rain and mud, the woman heard a voice call to her. A little boy with no coat on asked, "Do you have any food for us?" He was joined by a girl with a light sweater. The woman had to apologize for not having any that day, but if they would tell their parents to contact the police or firemen, they might be able to deliver some. The woman, heartbroken over her encounters in Death Valley, asked readers, "Of course, we are all very busy, but is there anyone who can't find the time to help a child if he were asked, 'Is there any meat?' or 'Do you have any food for us?'" It took until 1963 for the city to begin to do something about Death Valley. Today, the area is Millrace Park.
Sometimes people ask me, what kinds of things do you write about? Why do you write about some things like this? And one of the reasons is to show that bad things happen everywhere. That sometimes people actually do things to try to turn the bad things around and turn them into good things. And Millrace Park came out of Death Valley. And people got together and worked together to put this thing together. So that's one of the things that I like to do. No idea, I had all these transitions in there, made the things go away. All right. The chapter in this book is called The Prince of Rascals. It's about William Henry Schreiber. You may know that you probably don't recognize that building right now, but it's at 4th and Washington. It's the old PNC building, the PNC branch downtown. And it was the first national bank back in the 1800s when Will Schreiber stole some money from it and some other things. Nobody knew how William Henry Schreiber could afford the life of luxury he was living in Columbus in the late 1880s. The 22-year-old teller and bookkeeper at First National Bank was earning a modest $62 per month in 1888. Yet he lived much richer. Schreiber's need for extravagance ate away at him until it culminated in his robbing his own employer. On the night before Thanksgiving 1888, Schreiber ripped off First National Bank at the southeast corner of 4th and Washington Streets and skipped town with $8,500 in cash, well over $200,000 in today's dollars, and also $300,000 worth of non-negotiable securities. And like I said, most recently the PNC Bank, I loved going in there because it was all the old time bank kind of thing, and the tellers windows with the wrought iron and everything. But here's an excerpt from the chapter that tells us about the robbery and Schreiber's escape to Canada. The day the robbery was discovered, the bank's president, Captain William J. Lucas, took off for Toronto, hoping to interview Schreiber and perhaps bring back the notes that he had stolen. Lucas did not let the news of the plan leak out should Schreiber catch wind of it and go elsewhere. Lucas took a train to Detroit, where he switched trains and headed for Toronto. As the train was about to roll into Toronto on Saturday morning, Lucas was sitting in his berth when the curtains in the berth on the other side of the aisle opened and a familiar face stared at him. "Hello there, Schreiber," Lucas said, recognizing his former employee, despite the fact that Schreiber had attempted to disguise himself by shaving his mustache and side beard off. His hair was also closely cropped, and there was a shining spot on the crown of his head a few inches across that had also been shaved, giving him the appearance, Lucas stated, of a Catholic priest. The change in appearance didn't fool Lucas. A shocked Schreiber composed himself before returning the salutation. The fact that Lucas and Schreiber ended up on the same train had shocked both of them. Schreiber had no idea that Lucas was coming to Toronto, and Lucas thought Schreiber was already there. The night of the robbery, Schreiber had traveled from Indianapolis to Chicago, where he got his new look. He then moved on to Milwaukee, where he deposited the securities and some of the cash in Merchants National Bank. Schreiber took a steamer across Lake Michigan, then a sleeper car on a train bound for Toronto. It was on that very same sleeper car that Lucas boarded at Detroit. 100 miles later, the two met face to face. The meeting was uncomfortable for both parties. They had known each other since Schreiber was an infant, and Lucas had thought Schreiber to be honest. For a time, Schreiber had been thought by many of the local residents as a model young man, but he had turned out to be the Prince of Rascals, is what it said in the paper. And I just like Prince of Rascals, so I'd probably say that several times. There were some news accounts. There's William Lucas, the president of the bank, and there's a story in the Evening Republican about the bank being robbed and $8,500, which doesn't sound a lot, but when you consider it was it's worth $200,000 today, that's quite something. And we talk in the book a little bit about how he was able to do this on the night before Thanksgiving and what happened after the bank president got a hold of him. Let's see here. We don't have time to go into all of them, so I will just, instead of reading something about the history of prostitution in Columbus, just tell you shortly a little bit about it. Late 1800s, especially early 1900s, it was a fairly common practice here. Officials tended to look the other way unless the House of Ill Repute was also doing other illegal activities, such as selling illegal booze. Unless they had a license, they were not allowed to sell liquor or beer, things like that. If they didn't have problems with violence, authorities tended to leave him alone for the most part. So one of the most famous madams here in Columbus was Lillian. She went by Toady Tull, and she was late 1800s, probably about 20 years in Columbus before she finally left 1912. And that's actually the Pennsylvania Road Depot. The railroad used to come in kind of on Jackson Street there, and I think that might be the Sarwan building behind that. But 7th and Jackson's where the depot was, and a lot of these houses of ill repute, early 1900s, were kind of along Jackson Street. Toady Tull's last place was 9th and Jackson. It was a former school, the Bartholomew County Academy, which was the precursor to Columbus High School. And so she had bought that old building and used that. This one is one of my favorites. Having been in the newspaper business, we had, I'll just start in. On a cold December day in 1877, the youngest mayor in Indiana and the oldest newspaper editor in the state engaged in a bloody fist fight on a downtown Columbus street. Mayor George W. Cooper was 26 years old, and Daily Evening Republican editor Isaac M. Brown was 56 when the fight took place. Both men ended up with superior reputations in their chosen fields, but events in the fall of 1877 seemed out to bring the worst in both of them. Here's an excerpt from the chapter that details the story of the feud. Brown's newspaper the next day, you know what? I'm going to put these cheers on. So we'll make this reading just a little bit easier. All right. Okay, Brown's newspaper the next day lambasted the mayor. His son and the Daily Evening Republican's publisher, Isaac T. Brown, sought Cooper's immediate resignation with these words printed at the top of page 1. A more dastardly and premeditated attack was never made upon an editor or citizen by any city official, and we shall now have a public meeting of all parties to be held at the courthouse as soon as possible to publicly demand the resignation of the mayor as an unworthy official. If we had a yellow dog that was guilty of so contemptible an act, we should take him out and shoot him. Oh, it gets better. Truly, the mayor isn't fit company for a cur. I had to look that word up. It means mongrel. That edition of the newspaper also rehashed virtually every complaint it had made against Cooper and the current city administration since the election that May, adding in a few more allegations, insinuations, and rumors that had not previously been printed. It was written that Cooper was a friend of the Green Blind, which meant illegal drinking establishments back then, and had engaged in playing cards in one of the illegal gambling hells in town within the past 2 weeks. The publisher finished this particular diatribe with the admonishment, "Let the people blush for the mayor, since all shame has long since forsaken him." Like I said, it gets better. But Isaac T. Brown did not stop there. He threw a few more choice words at Cooper on his pages, calling the mayor a pitiful coward, this mass of flesh thrown together in a rude shape and topped out with bristles that stand on end like quills upon the fretful porcupine. He's right. A corrupt sneak, and finally, yes, a nincompoop. That's the reason why this is one of my favorites. An interesting side note is that Brown had actually sought the Republican nomination for mayor that year, but finished second in the primaries. He almost had these two guys running against each other for mayor in May. And there's a view of Washington Street looking north from 3rd Street. The fight they had would have been right about here, right by this carriage. So that's what's right. The Kids Commons is really close to there right now. So that's where the fight took place. There was blood. Somebody lost part of a finger. There was part of a beard gouged out. It was pretty nasty. Okay, here's another one we're gonna kind of jump through pretty quickly. This is the most recent story in the book. 1977, Dr. Griffith Mar was poisoned at back then it was Bartholomew County Hospital. And some of the other doctors who were there at the time were implicated in different ways, not necessarily with the poisoning, but with things like love triangles, defamation of character, a plot to kill somebody's husband. There were so many things that this thing went off in so many different tangents. It was just unbelievable. But Dr. Griffith Mar was part of the anesthesiology department. My sister-in-law actually worked there at the time. She was a surgical nurse, and she told me that the rift between the ones who had private practice and came in to do anesthesiology and the ones who were the full-time anesthesiologists, there was kind of a nasty rift there. So when Dr. Mar got poisoned, a metallic-y sort of looking white powdery substance on his fish and peas at lunch after performing surgery that he thought was just some new flavoring of some seasoning of some sort. Immediately knew there was some weird taste to it, made himself throw up. He was still in the hospital for 2 days just from that little amount of poison. I found out about the story from his daughter, actually. Oh, you're writing a book about wicked Columbus, Indiana stories? My dad was poisoned. He's like, I can't tell you anything, but whatever you look up, you know. So it was interesting. Attempted murder, like we talked about, the poisoning. Dr. Jacobs was implicated in certain things, and he filed a defamation of character suit against the city and the police and different things. So, like I said, this thing just went off the charts into 50,000 different weird directions. Breaking the booze laws. Oh, Kimberly's up for this one. She gets booze in slums. I gave her prostitution once, and she didn't like that. Just go.
Just do what I'm told. All right, we're going to talk about blind tigers, bootleggers, and booze laws. From a person who does not drink, this is fun. Even during times of legal liquor in Columbus, some skirted the laws, and the saloons and taverns were said to be bastions of filth, ne'er-do-wells, gambling, and other vices. The Indiana arm of the Anti-Saloon League of America, formed in 1898, worked with both political parties to achieve some of the driest legislation in the country. Indiana's legislature continued to pass increasingly restrictive prohibition laws. The blind tiger law, passed in 1907, allowed for the search and seizure of suspected illegal saloons. If convicted of operating a blind tiger, the defendant would receive a mandatory jail sentence, making this one of the strictest laws in the country. Here's an excerpt from the chapter of the book dealing with the booze laws. There were benches in front of John Carr's saloon on 3rd Street between Jackson and Washington that for years were used by men to while away the hours, whittling and talking and waiting for a friend to invite them inside for a drink. Those benches were removed by the city in 1911 as officials seemed to get tired of too many men of leisure hanging around outside the saloon. One of those rare times when a patron was actually kicked out of Carr's saloon, the man sued Carr for $5,000 when he sustained a broken leg upon getting tossed. Elijah Hankins alleged that in August 1913, he was wrongfully sold whiskey at the saloon as he was intoxicated. Never mind that serving intoxicated customers was a common occurrence in Carr's place. Hankins said he was already staggering out of the bar on his own after the bartender, Robert Erskine, ordered him to leave. When Erskine unnecessarily pushed him out of the place, causing him to fall on the steps and break his leg. This, he said, made him a cripple for life. It took 2 hotly contested trials, the jurors did not agree after the first one, before $250 was awarded to Hankins' wife Zula during the loss of her husband's earning power. Some might say that Elijah Hankins put up quite a stink at the second trial. At one point, Hankins was asked to remove his socks and shoes to show the jury both his healthy leg and his injured one. He stood on top of the table where his attorney, William J. Beck, had been sitting to give the jury a good look. Beck at once sniffed the air, raised his eyebrows, and moved back from the table in disgust. It became apparent that Beck felt as though Hankins had not washed his feet in happens sometimes. The attorney refused to sit at the table again until it was washed of the dust that had fallen from Hankins' feet and was disinfected.
I tried to find the most interesting stories along with, the wicked, nefarious, evil, terrible, nasty, unfortunate things. Elijah Hankins' feet just had to be in that book. Love and Bullets. I don't know how close the Evening Republican got on their sketches to what these people really look like, but their eyes looked completely off. Anyway, glasses, I'm not used to putting these on. All right. When Ralph Drake was sober, he was by all accounts an engaging young man, well-liked and respected by nearly everyone he came in contact with. But when he was on the bottle, he was a completely different person. Ida Ward got to know both sides of Ralph Drake. Though married to another man at the time, she fell in love with the sober side. She lost her life to the intoxicated side when Drake shot her on May 27, 1893, in the Plymate rooming house on 7th Street. Here's an excerpt from the chapter that details the story of Ralph Drake and Ida Ward. The trial lasted about 10 days, and 75 witnesses testified. County Health Officer George T. McCoy testified that on the night of the shooting, Drake confessed, saying, "There is nothing to tell you, doctor, nothing. You see it all. I want to die. Let me die. I told her I would kill her and then kill myself, and I have failed to do so." Ida Ward's mother, Mrs. George Cook, created a stir with her testimony. Instead of answering the question she was asked, she made whatever statement she pleased and didn't seem to care when admonished by the court. She did say that a few days before the shooting, Drake came to her house and left with her daughter, saying, "I am a gentleman and have money to take care of your daughter, and I'm going to take her now. It is now or never." One of Drake's star witnesses was Dr. J.Y. Kennedy of Flat Rock. Kennedy was a close friend of Drake's, just about the only companion for a 3-year period, and had also practiced medicine at St. Louis Crossing, treating Drake for delirium tremens, a rapid onset of confusion usually caused by withdrawal from alcohol. Kennedy had sometimes seen Drake pour down 8 alcoholic drinks in a matter of moments and considered him of unsound mind for several years. When Drake drank to excess, he would claim friends and acquaintances were out to get him and converse with them when they were not present, according to Kennedy. At the request of Drake's family, Kennedy took Drake on an extended trip to Colorado and other places out west, about 17 months before the shooting. On the way back home from that trip, Kennedy took Drake to Dwight, Illinois, and left him at the Keeley Institute to undergo the famed Keeley treatment, or gold treatment, as it was called. Shortly after he returned to the area, Drake moved in with his mother. Kennedy concluded that Drake's mind had gotten worse over the past 3 years, with strong drink being the major factor. By the time the defense had finished making its case, it had called 40 witnesses, all of whom said Drake was of unsound mind. The prosecution, meanwhile, focused mainly on men who had business dealings with Drake, and they all said Drake seemed of sound mind when they dealt with him. Many thought that Drake would get off on the insanity plea, but the jury saw things otherwise and found him guilty of murder in the 2nd degree. He was ordered to be sentenced to the fullest extent of the law, which meant life in prison. Addendum here. Ralph Drake ended up spending 16 years in prison, getting paroled in 1909, thanks to years of begging and pleading by a team headed by his mother. When he returned home to Columbus, he found out that his mother had been killed by a train just a few minutes before he arrived. As she hurried to the Columbus train depot near 7th and Jackson Streets to meet her son she had not seen in 12 years. So she worked all that time to get him out of jail and then didn't see him again. And there's one of the stories, the headlines. They had so many headlines. You could see decks of headlines back in the papers in those days. So you get something fantastical at the top, and then a little bit more information as you get through. And really, most of that could have been a part of the story, but that's the way they did it back then. You know, here's another one that I'll just talk briefly about. We had the KKK in the 1920s had a lot of political power in Indiana. Columbus was no exception. The top item from the newspaper was from probably the first actual real talk about the Ku Klux Klan in Columbus, 1922. There's a guy who came up from Georgia, stood on, I think, right where, well, I still call it Smith's Row, but 4th Street, between Washington and whatever the next street over is. Franklin, I should know that. So he got on a, kind of a soapbox sort of thing and was giving a soapbox speech and wanted to get in to, I think it was City Hall, and give a speech. They wouldn't let him, they wouldn't give him a permit, and there were people not knowing exactly what was going on, only knowing that somebody who wanted to give a speech was not allowed to get a permit to give one. So some people got behind this guy and said, well, we might not agree with what he says, but he should at least have a forum if he wants to speak. That drummed up all sorts of excitement, and a lot more people probably went than would have had they just gone ahead and given him the permit to begin with. But so through the 20s and the 30s, the Klan had some, power, and in certain elections, you were either a Klan supporter or you were against the Klan, and that's how you ran. Down here on the lower right, this is actually the first Klan parade demonstration in Columbus, and it was around 22 or 25, something like that. There were not very many people there. In the 60s, you had a march around the courthouse, and there were many more Klansmen, and there were parades in the 30s and things like that, where there were a lot more people involved. But this one, there weren't too many. Later on in the 60s, they regained a little bit of notoriety, power, and opened a chapter. There was an ad in the paper asking people to join. Oh, we're not quite ready for that. Before the KKK, there were people called the Whitecappers. And this is late 1800s, early 1900s, and they acted somewhat similar to the KKK. They would, except it was just, they kind of went after people they thought were not obeying the law or that the law wasn't catching up with. And if they thought you were bad to your wife, they would come and they would beat you, or they would hang you, or whatever. And it had nothing to do with race or creed or anything like that. It's just if they thought you weren't a good person, even if you were in custody, that did not stop them sometimes. The Whitecappers would go and get people who were in police custody, and in jails, and go and take them. So, that kind of died out in the early 1900s. They called them Whitecappers because they were Whitecaps. So, here's another one, and we're getting pretty close to the time where we're going to, open it up for questions. So, you know what? I think we've got 5 minutes to read this one. This is kind of fun. Bad Boys of Columbus. We have a couple of families, the Bells and the McKinneys, early Columbus, and fathers taught sons, and there was a lot of violence, a lot of drinking was heavily involved a lot of times when they had problems, and it was just not very nice people there for a while. The McKinney and Bell brothers terrorized Columbus during its early days. Theft, gambling, and violence, often mixed with alcohol, were trademarks of these men. The McKinneys arrived on the scene in 1819, with the Bells operating late in the 19th century. Here's an excerpt from that chapter that talks about the Bad Boys of Columbus. Joseph McKinney's brother, John, came to Bartholomew County shortly after his brother did. Together, they controlled the Democratic Party here for more than a decade. John, who was his brother's partner in all endeavors, both honest and dishonest, was more violent than Joseph, and he taught his sons to be that way too. John McKinney took over as sheriff in 1836 when John F. Jones resigned during 2 trials, which the penalty was hanging. Jones couldn't make himself officiate at the hangings, but McKinney no doubt rather enjoyed himself, according to a diary kept by General Harrison Buck Terrell, a local historian of the time. Despite his dishonesty and immorality, John McKinney was so entrenched in local politics that he remained sheriff for 4 years. He then ran for state legislature as a Democrat, but was defeated by Minister Williamson Terrell, cousin of Buck Terrell. For many years, John lived on a farm on Indianapolis Road adjoining the city. Later, he moved into a house on Jackson Street between 3rd and 4th, the location of the current post office. McKinney's death is another example of how stubborn he could be. His neighbor across the alley on Jackson Street was a shoemaker named Cook. Both Cook and McKinney had several small children who used to get to quarreling. Imagine that. One day, McKinney decided he was going to spank one of the Cook children to teach him a lesson. He was just about to bring his hand down on the child's rear end when the Cook's dog, quote, a savage beast, found its protective instincts. The dog bit McKinney on the calf, forcing him to release the child. The injury should have been a minor one, but McKinney refused to have it treated. Over the course of a few days, the injury became a major one and put McKinney in bed. The leg became so swollen that amputation was advised, but McKinney refused, saying he preferred death to having his limb removed. And so it was. What's up next? Oh, okay. So the book came out in 2016. It was on the bestseller list at Viewpoint, the weekly listings for, I don't know how long, a year and a half, 2 years. And in 2016, even though it was only out for half the year that year, it was the #2 best-selling nonfiction book at Viewpoint. So I was pretty happy with that. And now, did you do that? I did not. I don't remember doing this curtain thing.
I didn't touch
That was
yours.
pretty cool.
I do my own programs.
That's worth the price of admission right there. Okay. Okay. I've got contact information at the bottom of there for either way you can get a hold of me. I've got email address for my publishing company, and I've got information for my author. I've got business cards back there. If you don't want to write anything down, just grab business cards. That's fine. But does anybody have any questions?
I have a question.
Oh.
Wasn't there a Sheriff McKinney
Yeah,
not too long ago?
yeah, Jim McKinney.
Jim.
Is it the same family? Same family? Do we know?
I don't know that. I haven't looked into it. I actually worked with a Jim McKinney in Shelbyville, but I know he wasn't sheriff of anything. He was from St. Paul.
Yeah, this is when I was a kid.
I was just gonna add, I moved here in '77, which was a long time ago. And I had my 2 little kids at a Halloween parade down Washington Street. And then they went to the Commons and they walked up over the stage of the Commons. They were giving awards for cutest, most creative, scariest, blah, blah, blah. And suddenly I looked up and there were 2 boys in white sheets carrying ball bats going across the stage in 1977. I burst into tears. I thought, what have I moved to? But
Yeah, I heard, in the book I talk about, particular 1 or 2 cross burnings and, a few other things. And that would have been in the late 60s to mid 70s, most of that kind of thing.
And then my realtor, who was helping me search for a house, I said, oh, that has really nice curb appeal. I like that one. And she said, oh, no, you don't. They eat greens there. Not funny. So, that kind of prejudice was still going on, and I'm sure it still exists to some extent here.
Yeah, in different ways.
Mhm.
Yes.
If somebody wanted to do a ghost walk in Columbus for money, and their main source was your book, would they have to pay you royalties?
Now you have an idea.
I'm going to say yes. But I don't think so.
Probably not legally, but ethically.
Well, anybody can look at, addresses and whatever in the book, and, you can know that Carr's Saloon became the Wagon Wheel, and which is right in where Columbus Bar is now. I'm not sure if it's the exact building, but it was on that, on that street, so.
Maybe you two should collaborate, that sounds fun.
I know somebody who gives ghost tours in Nashville, Tennessee,
All over,
Tennessee.
all over the country.
Yeah, they're all over the place.
It's
Yeah.
those kind of stories, exactly.
What years did you work for Home News Enterprise?
I started in 1999 is when I started.
I had a reason for asking that question, because on that slide where you've got the white campers and the KKK, that ad in the lower left-hand corner for members to join, I don't believe we had zip codes back when that was published.
It was, I think it was Elizabethtown was the,
Right, but we didn't use zip codes back when that ad came out, so I'm thinking. You
okay,
said it was the 60s.
that was the 60s or the 70s, yeah,
Okay.
so,
Just saying.
yeah, it was in the paper, that's all I know.
Curious, when did you find out when mill race became mill race? What happened to people living at Death Valley?
I tried to find that out because, it's, okay, they're moving.
Not that long.
By the time 1963 rolled around and they were displacing these people and building mill race, it probably had about half the residents that it, that it had, 15, 20 years earlier.
What was that? I have no idea.
Yeah, there weren't that many places left. And I tried to find out, where these people went, whether they went with, friends somewhere else in the city, or whether they, found someplace else for them to go.
But I mean, you say displaced, so they were basically booted out?
Well, basically, hopefully to better places. Yeah,
It's not a wicked story, but my mom was a lifelong resident, and she said that in Death Valley, the actress Joan Blondell lived there as a child.
Wow.
And I don't know if that's true or not, but I was
She's
just
from
wondering if you've
Columbus.
ever come, it's not wicked stories, but, famous people who lived here for a while and then moved on. And that.
there was a lady who wrote the book, Sylvia, who wrote the book
Yeah,
about the
Sylvia.
tree in Mill Race Park, and she put a yellow ribbon around it or something, and then they've got a plaque to the tree, that Sylvia had written the book, and I can't remember her last name right now. Yes, yes,
Sylvia
that's
Wharton.
it.
Okay.
I read that a long time ago.
My mom grew up in the area in Bartholomew County and lived here her whole life, and she was very poor. In fact, I am getting ready to publish a book about a story she told me about her childhood, but she told me that she felt sorry for the people who lived in Death Valley. And she grew up very poor, but to her, that was even worse, which was amazing to me because she told me all kinds of stuff about her life, but yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah,
What are you working on now? Are you writing something?
publishing. I bought the publishing company, and that's taken up most of my
So you're
time.
not writing, you're publishing it.
I've written a few short stories for my writers group, and I started a novel based in Ireland, and when I bought the publishing company, I don't have time to do this anymore. I had started a children's book before the Buddy Schumacher book, before I started finding out things about that, like, I can't do anything but work on this book. So, right now, I'm not actually actively writing anything. Eventually, I'm getting back to that book based in Ireland, because I think it's a book that needs to be written. Maybe just for myself.
Since you published Wicked Columbus and have been giving presentations on it, have you found that you've struck any nerves among descendants of people discussed in the book?
Fortunately, most of the stories are a really long time ago. That was one of the requirements from the publisher. They said, okay, you can do things. If it's gonna be as dark as a child dying, like your first book, it's going to be a really long time ago. And actually, nothing in this book we want really any sooner than like 50 years or so. So the Griffith Mar thing was kind of, And I ran into somebody at a talk one time who said he worked at the hospital at the time, and he didn't talk to me about it, so I don't know if he was upset or just didn't want to talk or what, but it's one of the things we're into. My first book, I did a lot of talks in Wisconsin, especially. Went up there, and I would give a talk at a theater, and I would hear things like, "That's my grandpa," you know, stuff like that. So, you know, it's really weird talking to people, you know, at some of those things, a small child getting murdered, and somebody came up to me afterwards and said, my uncle was so-and-so, and he did this, and he was a terrible person. Do you think my uncle could have had something to do with this? I'm like, I don't know. But thanks. Anything else? Yes?
Did you uncover any arson stories that were or were not in the book?
There were about 2 or 3 stories that sounded fairly interesting to me that I just didn't think I had enough material for. There might have been an arson. There was a shooting of a guy shot his wife down on State Street outside of a grocery store. And I didn't quite get enough information on that. And some of the other ones just seemed more interesting. So arson does sound kind of familiar, like there may have been an arson in what I
It's
saw.
just every ghost walk I've ever been on, there's been an arson
Well,
story.
yeah. Somebody's lighting fires somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can find one.
Okay, I did bring a few historical books here. I've got old maps of Columbus in this big book if anybody wants to flip through. I've got, this is the book that William Marsh wrote, and these are what they call the galleys. And this is what you would get to proof before they actually printed the book way back in the day. This is what they did, which I can't believe I found, but there's that. I'm not supposed to go in front of the screen because I'll turn into like a shadow or something. Directory of the City of Columbus. This one is 1902, 1903. And you can see every resident in here. They've got them alphabetized with the address. I don't think there's so many phone numbers in 1902, 03. There's a couple other books. And then I've got books for sale in the back. I think that's it. And if you just want to stop by and chat, that's fine too. I've got business cards. So I thank everybody for being here. It's been great to have a full house. And thank you, Mary Claire, for having me back. Thank you.